and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on the programme, Australia in mourning, following on from the worst mass shooting in almost 30 years, in which police accuse a father and son duo of killing 15 people at a Jewish celebration on the beachfront in Sydney. We'll be speaking to a witness who watched the events unfolding. Plus, we'll be examining the growing chorus of warnings about the threat posed by Russia. Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin with the latest on Sunday's mass shooting at Sydney's Bondi Beach. Well, the police there in Australia declared that attack, which targeted a Jewish celebration, to be a terrorist incident. Well, in addition to the 16 fatalities, one of whom was the gunman, a further 40 people were injured during the incident. Well, one of the two suspected shooters, as I said, is amongst the dead. The second, his son, was injured. Well, the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese called the attack, quote, an act of evil anti-Semitism. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Grace Matthew, who is an eyewitness and a resident of the Bondi area. She joins us now from Sydney. Grace, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. I mean, you've had an extremely traumatic, I gathered, 24 hours. I mean, first of all, how are you doing and how have you processed all of this?
It's been beyond belief, but sadly not surprising. And that's the sentiment that I've heard from a lot of my Jewish friends in particular. Deeply, deeply disturbing scenes in our beautiful home, a place that is just so representative of freedom and fun and family and community. And it was just so unexpected for us to have such a beautiful day interrupted by the scenes that we saw yesterday.
Yeah, one of the witnesses that I heard interviewed said she thought she heard fireworks, and in fact it turned out to be gunfire, as we now know. At what point did you become aware of exactly what was happening there on Bondi Beach?
It was a little too light for it to be fireworks. I think that there was, obviously Australia being such a peaceful nation, it's far more likely for a noise like that to be the sound of festivities than it is for it to be gunfire. But I was just about to walk down to where the Hanukkah festival, was happening down at Bondi Beach. And as I was about to walk down, less than a block away from it, I was probably 100 metres away, I noticed a group of people running up the hill. And I initially just thought they were a group of merrymakers running with their dog. And then another group ran past and they shouted, there's a shooting, there's a mass shooting, they're killing people. And I was just passing by a nearby church and the pastor pulled a group of us inside and locked the doors, moved us into an area where we could be safe. And a group of us just stayed there and prayed for peace and prayed for a miracle to save the people who were just so close by and yet who were facing a very different fate.
Yeah, I mean, a horrific situation by the sounds of things. And I'm just wondering, because you know the area well, I mean, did there tend to be lots of police around there and did they intervene quite quickly?
On a day like this past Sunday, which was a stunning day, the beach was packed with people from all areas of Sydney and tourists who'd come from around the world. Typically there would be a light police presence, but very light. The thing, though, that surprised me, because this was a major Jewish festival, and in the last 2.5 years, particularly following the attacks on October 7th, that have led to just so much sort of politicization and anti-Semitism, most public Jewish events have required a large amount of security and a solid police presence. And so I could not understand why there was seemingly no police support that was present during the attacks. And it took them many more minutes than I think it should have to respond. I can understand, though, Australia being such a peaceful place, I don't think many first responders would be used to this kind of a crisis. And I think no one knows how they'll respond in a moment like this. But it certainly shows that, we need greater training of and preparedness of any first responder, whether it be police people or beyond. Minutes later, once it had all kind of happened and the two shooters had been neutralised, the there were more sirens than I've ever heard in my life. There was, the place was lit up like a Christmas display with ambulances, sirens. There were police cars, army members, even helicopters coming through. So, just very sad that there was not that quick response that would have saved even more lives.
And Grace, as you've implied and as we've been reporting, that was by no means an isolated attack on Jewish people or Jewish institutions in Australia. Do you feel safe in Australia? Do you feel like Sydney is a safe place for you to be right now?
For the most part, yes. Australia, I've lived here the vast majority of my life. I was born here, and I've never... there would be very, very few moments that I would have ever felt unsafe. So it was a surreal thing to wake up the next morning and think, gosh, could there be a car bomb in a vehicle? Or are there more planned terror attacks? And how does one move through one's home area with that in mind? But I think that the way that the community has responded, and certainly the way that I've responded, is that no, we will not give in to fear. Like if terrorism is aimed at producing terror, then that is certainly not how we will be living, and we're not going to adjust our way of life to suit, the threat that a group would like to impose on Australia. This is a land that is, our national anthem says, Australians all let us rejoice, for we are young and free. And we're not going to be letting go of that ideal, and that will be how we continue to live. And I think that what will come from this is, a tightening of the laws around gun control, around immigration, around, all the various inputs that are required for us to continue to live free and boldly, embrace a life without fear.
There are a lot of people, a lot of profiles who've been, on the front pages and in the top stories these last 24 hours. There was, of course, the father-son duo. The father was killed at the scene. His 24-year-old son is in hospital. But there's this other person, the 43-year-old Sydney fruit shop owner, Ahmed Al-Ahmed, who tackled and disarmed the 24-year-old gunman. Do you think it's fair to say that a lot more people would have been killed were it not for the bravery of Ahmed Al-Ahmed?
Absolutely. I think that he is just the epitome of an Australian working class hero, as we like to call them. And it's been so heartwarming to see the outpouring of love and appreciation for this incredible man from the community. I think there's already been over $500,000 raised just from people wanting to contribute to say thank you and to honour his sacrifice and his bravery and courage in the face of such an incredible threat. I also think, though, that it really should cause each of us to think into ourselves, like, how can we, in moments of threat, not just run for our own safety, but lean into serving our neighbour and in some cases even walking into the line of fire if that means that we can be of service to others, and not for the sake of being heroes, but because I think our society really requires a level of unity and courage that has not been required of us in the last few decades. So I really hope that he inspires a lot of us to think very differently about how we're leading our everyday lives.
And there were lots of other heroes as well, weren't there? Not just the ones that made the front pages, but of course those in the emergency services. And then there were the standers-by who carried out CPR and first aid on people before the first responders got to them. I mean, I wonder if you saw any of that firsthand, and are there any unsung heroes that you think need to be singled out here?
I could tell you countless stories. I've had friends of mine who were at the scene, again, just enjoying the sunset, and then who were forced to go and help children or elderly people. I had a friend of mine who initially, when he heard the gunfire, ran away and then realized what was happening and ran back to help elderly people escape. I know of one gentleman who did a CPR course that day. He did a first aid course that day and then went down to the beach, and literally I was told that he prayed and said, dear God, please let me never have to use this knowledge that I now have, and found himself on the scene at the festival helping to revive someone who'd been shot. And he just happened to speak Russian, and the person who was with them spoke Russian. Like, just so many stories of people who, and you know, another person whose child sort of went missing amongst the melee of everything that was happening, and they then found that a lady had covered, like basically sheltered that child under her own body and put herself into the line of fire as a result. So just so many stories of people kind of going the extra mile, and really, you know, really there was so much courage that was shown. And I think it really is a testament to Australian society and the fact that we will band together. But it's just, I think we're still processing how incredibly disturbing the scenes were, and the fact that they were all caught on camera. You know, we just live in a very different world. And so I think there's a lot to come to terms with in terms of how this changes how we move forward.
Sure. And just lastly, Grace, I know you live really near, as you were telling us earlier, really near where all of this happened on Bondi Beach. And there is a makeshift memorial that's been set up there today. And I just wondered whether you feel like you have the strength and the will, really, to go and pay tribute at that memorial, or is that something you want to leave for later?
I spent most of the day at the memorial. You know, I shed a number of tears at moments. It's been a very, very difficult to come to terms with moment. But at the same time, you know, we heard from one of the local rabbis this afternoon, Rabbi Wolf, who lit candles for Hanukkah and shared a message that, you know, we are all called to be a light in the darkness, and that we're all called to bring a new level of unity, and that the strength of what we will come through this with is resilience that comes from us banding together as a society and really stamping out hate and saying no to fear and resisting in that manner. And so it's just been really incredible to see the mix of people who've come down in solidarity with the Jewish community, the Christians, even members of other various religious groups and other ethnic groups that have come down in solidarity and brought their heartfelt and wholehearted support. Politicians, celebrities, like a whole mix of society. And I think it's been really healing for us to come together and just see that in moments of crisis, we do unify, and we will continue to do so.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Grace Matthew, eyewitness and resident of the Bondi area of Sydney. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Well, let's get more analysis now. We can speak to Major General Chip Chapman, who's a security expert and the former head of counter-terrorism at the Ministry of Defence in the UK. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. I mean, according to reports, there's been a string of perceived or interpreted as anti-Semitic attacks in Australia, which have targeted buildings and individuals there since the 7th of October. And I'm wondering whether, in your mind, the warning signs were there ahead of Sunday's attack.
Well, what we've seen since 7/7 is a rise in both extremism and in hate crime. And what you've just described really is a manifestation of hate crime. That is not the same as terrorism, which must have a ideological, political, religious or racial component, and to have a significant human element in terms of death or destruction. That's the difference. There's not also necessarily a linear pathway between what you've described in terms of extremism and hate crimes and terrorism. That said, it seems that the Australian authorities have tolerated the intolerable, and that can be one of the definitions of extremism. And it can be that there are pathways between extremism and terrorism, but they're not necessarily linked.
Yeah, I mean, earlier on this year, the Australian government accused Iran of orchestrating a wave of anti-Semitic attacks, and that resulted in the ambassador of Iran being expelled from Australia. This happened 4 months ago. I mean, does that perhaps suggest there could have been an element of coordination or some sort of an organizational element to this attack on Sunday that perhaps hasn't been considered up until this point?
Well, no, not at all. At the moment, they're saying that there is no organizational link to IS, and they've certainly found Islamic State paraphernalia. So at the moment, you would probably say that this is inspired by, but not controlled from IS. Neither do I think it was plotted from IS. But some of the other questions you asked, because you said about the Iranian link, and of course, Iranians are generally Shia, not Sunni, is there a foreign link? That's one of the fundamental questions you ask after a terrorist attack, and that will be one of the avenues that the Australian authorities will be exploring, along with the two predominant questions which you ask after that, which is there another attack coming, and is there a network? Some of the other things we also ask are also in train. So, for example, what mistakes did government officials make? And of course, one of the antagonists, the one who's been killed, seemed to have a legal license for 6 guns. How was that allowed to happen in a country where gun laws after the 1996 massacre in Tasmania were heavily caveated? And lastly, what new authorities, laws or changes are needed? And it's always the case at the moment, they seem to go for the low-hanging fruit. That is, what changes do we need to gun laws, which are already very draconian, rather than looking at the first question you asked, Tom, which is, have they tolerated things which have led to a progression from hate crime and extremism into terrorism?
Right. I mean, it's according to a report that was published by Tel Aviv University, Australia and Italy are the 2 countries that have seen the most significant rise in anti-Semitic attacks in the course of 2024. And I'm just wondering why you think those 2 countries would stand out.
Well, they don't. So if you look at the TSAT report for 2025, which is the Terrorism Situation and Trend Report, none of those would mention terrorism in those countries. Indeed, in Italy, the greatest terrorist threat or manifestation in terms of those which are terrorist, either completed, failed or foiled, are left-wing or anarchist attacks. So again, you have to separate this the extremism and hate crime from terrorism. They can be different things, as I've said, and there is very little evidence of terrorist attacks against Jewish targets. That's not to say there hasn't been an exponential rise both in anti-Semitism, which there has in Europe, and in terms of anti-Islam, which again there also been. And so a lot of these threats that you've mentioned in these countries have been shaped by developments beyond both the EU border and the Australian border. And of course, the most predominant one is what has been going on in Gaza and how that has shaped the violent extremism narrative.
Right, and we've heard, in fact, in the last 24 hours, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu accusing the Australian government of, quote, pouring oil on the fire of anti-Semitism. And there he's referring to Canberra's decision to recognise Palestinian statehood that happened back in August. What's the logic here? Do you think that Prime Minister Netanyahu is getting at?
I think the logic he's getting at is that the recognising the Palestinian state seems to have been premature. So, for example, if you take a view which is different than that, for example, the Singaporean authorities, that they will only recognise a Palestinian state when 3 things pertain. Firstly, when there's an effective government. Secondly, when they accept the right of Israel to exist. And thirdly, they renounce violence. Now, in this case, at a very tactical level of the attack in Sydney, the protagonists didn't accept the right of Jewish people to exist, and neither, of course, did they go on a pathway of renouncing terrorism, because this was absolutely a terrorist act. So the Singaporean model seems to me to be what most countries should have gone to, rather than ploughing in before we've got something durable. And we're not even into phase 2 of the Gaza ceasefire yet. We're still in phase 1. We hope that phase 2 might happen in early 2026, but it's not a done deal that we'll get to phase 3 by any means, in the same way that we didn't get past phase 1 in the same time last year at the end of 2024.
The Prime Minister of Australia, Albanese, has said, we will do whatever is necessary to stamp out anti-Semitism. And I'm just wondering, I mean, what can a government realistically do to stamp out anti-Semitism?
Well, you have to look at what their definition of extremism is and how they would manifest in potentially changing that. Now, from a UK perspective, extremism has always been defined by both intolerance and by an ideology based on violence, hatred, or intolerance that aims to negate or destroy the fundamental rights of other people. If you have, or a country has allowed an atmosphere of sort of righteous impunity, is the way that some commentators have described it in Australia, then this can have its own pervasiveness, which allows anti-Semitism to rise. So, for example, one of the things which, I was over in Australia last year, my son lives there, the Palestinians in Sydney celebrated the 7th of October massacre at Sydney Opera House. They tolerated weekly street protests in Sydney, which are overtly anti-Semitic. So in terms of where are the limits of free speech and what things will you tolerate on the street, that is absolutely something that people can look at, because there's this notion in the West that free speech means that you can say anything, and that is patently not the case. Free speech should be there as a means, not an end in itself, and the means is to have an educated public which can debate things sensibly without going to a real right of arc sort of scenario where you get involved in violent extremism or Salafist jihadism, as we saw in this case.
Do you think other cities need to step up security for Jewish communities in light of what's happened there in Sydney?
Well, I think they probably do. I mean, one of the weaknesses, and I think the authorities in Sydney may be culpable here, is that if there has been this pervasive hate crime and extremism over the last 2 years, then the security of any crowded places events, because that's what we really talk about in counter-terrorist methodology, need to be looked at. So where there are events where there's a potentially heightened security profile, either because of the scale or who is involved in terms of the grouping, and here it's of course a Jewish celebration, then those things need to be secured in the same way. In this month, you would expect the Christmas markets to be secured in the same way that they have been over the last few years because of the attacks which happened on Christmas markets in Germany and other places in the last 7 or 8 years.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Really appreciate it. Major General Chip Chapman, security expert and former head of counter-terrorism in the Ministry of Defence in the UK. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Tom.
Now to the latest on the situation in Ukraine. And on the diplomatic front, talks between the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and the US envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner continued for a second day today in Berlin. Well, Ukraine's NATO ambitions, territory and elections are all reported to have been discussed. Well, for now, Kyiv appears to be pushing back against Washington's demands that it pull troops from the Donbass and cede territory. Well, these talks come as the NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte issued a chilling warning. He said that Russia could attack a NATO member state within the next 5 years. Meanwhile, the new head of Britain's foreign spy service, MI6, has also issued a warning, saying that Russia poses an acute threat, and she accused Moscow of, quote, exporting chaos. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Lieutenant General David Leakey, who is a former British Army general. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Let's start by talking about the diplomatic efforts. These talks continuing in Berlin, Washington saying that a lot of progress has been made towards ending the conflict in Ukraine. Are you seeing signs of that progress too?
I'm not sure. The big issue here, and I think people tend to lose sight of it, although it's come much more clearly into focus in the last days and weeks in the news reporting, the big issue here is territory, and not just territory, but sovereignty as well. So President Putin's strategic aim was to subjugate Ukraine and bring it back into the Russian sphere of influence, not just sphere of influence, but under its Russian Federation control. It considers Ukraine as part of Russia, the same religion, the same ethnicities, and for Russia, Ukraine is part of what they used to call the near abroad. In other words, the buffer that protects Russia both militarily but also economically. And President Putin has never, ever conceded that he's never conceded that he will adjust his strategic objective here. So if he is going to agree to a peace, he has got to go back to the Russian people with some success out of the enormous loss of blood and treasure, Russian blood and treasure. So for Putin, he has to have a substantial take of Ukrainian territory. On the other hand, for Zelensky, he has to show, and the Ukrainian people have to get credit for defending their territory, and to give up any more would be for them tantamount to a defeat. And it would set up a precedent, both sort of internationally, politically, not in law, but a precedent internationally, that if you go and bite off bits of someone else's country, the international community is going to agree to that. And that sets a terrible precedent for stability globally, never mind just in Europe. And if we're talking about Europe, and then speaking back to your comments of the head of MI6 and Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, both promoting the idea that Russia presents a genuine threat to Europe. And there's plenty of evidence for it. And both Mark Rutte and the head of MI6 has come out with a great list of things that Russia has done, or is alleged reportedly has done, as part of its struggle with Europe. And Putin would never say, at the moment at least, that he is at war with Europe. But what I think in Russian, they have a different word for war and struggle, just as we do. And what Putin is doing with Ukraine is he's having a war with Ukraine as part of the struggle with Europe. And the struggle with Europe is that he does not want Europe influence or intervention in or near the Russian Federation. And so he is going to continually make a nuisance of himself to the Europeans in order to keep the Europeans out.
Okay.
So that's where we are. And so far as the peace talks are going, I think the big issue is who's going to get what territory.
Right.
That's the first big issue. There are lots of underlying things, security guarantees and what sanctions can be put on Russia if we fail to get an agreement.
Okay, we'll come back to the warnings that have come from NATO, MI6, and Britain's military air chief as well. We'll come back to those in just a moment. But it sounds to me as though you might agree with what the EU foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, has been saying. She said that the Donbass region, that's one of the regions that Ukraine is under pressure to give up, will not be President Putin's end game, she thinks. Would you agree with that, therefore, that if he's given that territory, he might then perhaps eye up some more territory?
Yes, I think if he's given the Donbass, this is my interpretation of it. If Putin is given the Donbass and that's agreed, I would say this is not a peace outcome; it's a ceasefire outcome. It's go back to 2014 when the Russians took Crimea. Which was a disgraceful act of piracy, of international piracy, of a land grab by one country grabbing somebody else's sovereign territory. Go back to 2014. The international community just said to Russia, well, I'm afraid, that's the way it is. And to Ukraine, that's the way it is. And Russia said, well, good, we've got away with it this time, we'll do it again. And they have. And now they've taken what they hope they'll take, the Donbass. And so that will just be another step in the very, very long-term thinking, which is what the Russians have. Their strategic strategies go out 20, 30, 50 years, and some of them are published and are written about in open publications. And it's very clear that they want Ukraine, and that will remain a strategic objective to bring Ukraine into the Russian near abroad sphere of influence, subjugation, whatever they can get. And that is their strategic aim. So getting the Donbass, getting a ceasefire agreement now, getting a withdrawal of troops, stop the fighting, stop the killing, that's fine. Okay. What needs to be behind that to make it a peace rather than a ceasefire are security guarantees on the side of the Ukrainians, and on the other side, the penalties which Russia would suffer if they didn't stick with that peace agreement. And the penalties that Russia would have to suffer are going to have to be much more consequential than the sort of rather feeble sanctions that have been imposed on their banking, their currency trading, and particularly their resource trading, particularly oil trading. They've so many workarounds on this now that, and I'm never quite sure how much the sanctions are working on Russia. Clearly, their economy is a war economy. It's not a peacetime economy. And in the next 2 or 3 years, their sort of civil infrastructure, their civil economy will collapse to the point of popular dissatisfaction. The war economy can't go on at this rate for more than another maybe year, 2, 3 years possibly. But beyond that, it can't.
Okay.
But if they get a ceasefire now, and then it gives them 3 or 4 years to re-establish their armed forces, learn all the lessons from Ukraine, build up their economy again, get the oil flowing, build up their currency reserves, they'll be ready to go again. So the next time they come, the sanctions have got to be much more brutal from the outset, as well as the military defense against Russian aggression, if they persist.
Okay, so I mean, Ukraine is in a situation where it's under pressure from two sides right now to hand over territory, namely the Russians, and also, it would appear, the United States as well. And I'm wondering whether you think realistically Ukraine can resist that pressure.
Well, I suspect one of the debating points here is the extent to which Ukraine militarily and financially can go on, because although I mentioned just now that Russia might be able to sustain their war economy and military effort for another maybe 2 years, possibly, but beyond that, it gets very difficult. Ukraine, I think, is in greater difficulty on 3 fronts: one, financially, economically, and their economy is in trouble, and they've got limited military resources. What will put that right, to a certain extent, is liberating the $150 or so billion of Russian assets that are frozen in Europe and loaning those to Ukraine. That would be a big boost to Ukraine. It would allow them to sustain the present effort war economy for a while longer. But ideally, that money should be being paid into the rebuilding of the Ukrainian infrastructure. The problem with Ukraine at the moment is that they are suffering huge infrastructure damage, millions of hours of electricity, of electrical power being denied to the population. And Russia knows very well that the Ukrainian population, the will of the Ukrainian population will, well, I don't know. The question is, how long is the elastic before it breaks, before the will of the people breaks? And I think that Europe knows that on the Ukrainian side is probably slightly will take less time, I think, than breaking the will of the Russian people.
Okay, let's just quickly, well, we've got 2 minutes left, talk about those warnings that have been issued by the head of NATO, the head of MI6, and the British military Air Chief Marshal. We've heard from them, let's take Air Chief Marshal Richard Knighton's warning. He says, President Putin's aim is to challenge, limit, divide, and ultimately destroy NATO. Similarly chilling messages from Mark Rutte and the head of MI6. Who do you think is the intended audience of those warnings?
I think there are 3 audiences for those warnings. One is Putin. And for Putin to be told, we know what his game is, and we're going to resist that. So that's one message. I think one message is for President Trump and the Americans, and that is to say, if you don't recognize what Putin is trying to do, this is what he's trying to do. So please understand that. And Ukraine is part of that story. And secondly, to President Trump, we understand that. And we've understand your message, President Trump, and the Europeans are going to have to be stronger and spend more in combating the Russian aggression. And the third message, or the third audience rather for the message, is the citizenry, if I can put it that way, of the European nations. We have to realize that we are under threat. I mean, I can't go through the list now, but there is an enormous list of at the last time I saw it, I think it was over 130 acts of sabotage, flight incursions, gas pipeline cuttings, fiber optic cables, and so on being dug up from the seabed. All of these things attributed to the Russians, and interference internally in our countries. There have been arson attacks and so on. All of these things are just pricking away at the Europeans. But if you ask most European citizens, I've just been traveling in Germany recently, and I talked to my German counterparts there, and they're very busy with their lives, running businesses, running family lives. The threat from Russia does not signify. The citizenry of Europe is, I think, insensitive to the threat that Russia poses. It's not to them real. And therefore, when ministers start saying we're going to have to up defense spending by 1%, 2%, or 3% more than we have in the past, citizens will say, but why? They haven't got that message through. And by and large in Europe, ministers aren't willing to give that message because it's unwelcome news. And the exception to that is, of course, in the countries that are closest to the Russian Federation. So the countries on the eastern boundary of the European Union, the Baltic states, Poland,
Right.
and so on. And they feel the heat, much more so. And the increase in defense spending, or the level of defense spending in those countries, is much more accepted by the citizenry there than it is elsewhere in Europe. And the further you go west in Europe, then the less will there is amongst the population to recognize the problem or spend money on it. If you go to Portugal, Spain, Italy, there is a declining interest in knowledge of or willingness to spend on anti-Russian threats and the deterrence that goes with that.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you very much indeed, Lieutenant General David Leakey. Thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.
Thank you, Tom.
That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.